Afternoon, friends and comrades. I'm Thomas Murray Dawson with Center for Political Education, joining you from the occupied lands of the Ohlone people in the East Bay of California. As always, the chat is disabled for these calls, so if you want to hear from us with any questions you have, please just drop them in the Q&A by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Um, and we'll try our best to answer them there. And in that same toolbar, there is a button for the Q&A function. Sorry, not the Q&A function, the CC closed caption function, which you can use to get closed captionings during the call. And as always, please support the PSAs if you can by donating to the link that Annie is going to drop into the chat. Um, with that, let me just make sure the recording is ready. Great. On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome back to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening on the ground in Palestine, the most recent calls to action and ways to plug into solidarity work. If you're returning, thanks for sticking with us. And as always, please share these calls with your comrades, colleagues, and friends. The recordings are all available on CPE's YouTube channel and usually go up the afternoon after they are recorded. Okay. So at a press briefing yesterday, BBC News reporter Tom Bateman asked State Department spokesperson Matt Miller if he would publicly identify whom the U.S. believed carried out the mass bombing attack on pagers and other electronic devices in Lebanon. Despite the global consensus that Israel was responsible, Miller refused. Nor would he address the illegality of such attacks under international law, even as Bates emphasized the widespread human casualties from the attacks, which included the deaths of 2 children and scores of people brutally maimed in public places. To quote Bateman, international law prohibits the use of booby traps. Historically, there are a wide range of international conflicts in which our government has engaged in the kind of equivocation and doublespeak we've heard constantly from Miller and other administration mouthpieces over the last several months about the applicability of international standards regarding warfare and human rights to the US and its allies. But what's unique about what we're witnessing in the international order right now is the constant pace at which the US and Israel are working to violate human rights, flout international law, and undermine trust in the international order itself by disavowing, villainizing, or even murdering the UN officials within the institutions entrusted with administering the so-called rules-based international order, or the journalists tasked with documenting the abuses themselves. Objectively, the lies and half-truths from U.S. officials have been so obvious, and subjectively, their responses, and I'm thinking a lot about Miller and Kirby and Jean-Pierre, have smacked of a smugness and even conniving that feigns neutrality or even morality in the face of senseless mass murder. Throughout the time we've been running these PSAs, we've returned time and again to the contradiction between the mandates of U.S. empire and the strictures of international law. And the recurring questions have been, does international law mean anything? Is the rules-based order over? What then is the path forward? Notwithstanding a nuanced analysis from historians and scholars that have identified that international law has been both a tool of sanctifying colonial power and a limited path of resistance for the global South, the rapid accumulation of subversion against that order by the US and Israel during the genocide in Gaza has brought the world, in the words of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to a quote, knife's edge. Yesterday, a group of UN experts, including Francesca Albanese, the now renowned special rapporteur on Palestine, issued an urgent warning to all global states to follow the mandate of the International Court of Justice. In the statement, they emphasized that the court had provided, quote, unequivocal directions concerning the responsibilities of states and international organizations with regard to Israel's unlawful occupation. They assessed that states appear unwilling or unable to, quote, take the necessary steps to meet their obligations, despite the genocide, domicide, herbicide, scholasticide, meticide, cultural genocide, and ecocide being undertaken against Palestine and the Palestinian people. Among the many measures they outline that states must undertake, they point to the necessity to impose a full arms embargo on Israel and to impose sanctions on anyone involved in the unlawful occupation and apartheid regime. Historian Asal Rad, who has famously undertaken a project to correct Western headlines around the Gaza genocide, made a social media post yesterday that detailed the ways in which the New York Times has been soft-pedaling questions about Israel's war crimes. In reference to the atrocities at Al-Shifa Hospital, the headline then read, how international law views military action at a hospital. In reference to Israel's illegal disruption of humanitarian aid, the headline read, Israel, Gaza, and the Law of Starvation in War. In response to Israel's bombing of the Iranian embassy in Damascus, it read, quote, Israel bombed an Iranian embassy complex. Is that allowed? And finally, with regard to this week's terrorist attack in Lebanon, the headline read, quote, walkie-talkie and pager attacks set off a legal debate. The point here may be obvious. This year of Zionist impunity and UP's obfuscation has had collaborators and co-conspirators across the Western landscape and nation states, including tech companies and media, mainstream media in particular, and has created an environment in which other global states are refusing to uphold the integrity of the ICJ decision on Palestine. But that failure, according to the authors of the UN statement, quote, jeopardizes the entire edifice of international law and the rule of law in world affairs. Thanks again for joining us for another PSA. Samer will be here to do some analysis. And first, let's hear from Melissa Fan with a grounding exercise.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today, I want us to revisit the somatic practice of holding contradictions. We did a short practice a few weeks back, and let's revisit that practice. The necessity of holding contradictions is that we live in a world full of contradictions, from the political contradictions of living in a country which espouses a certain set of values while doing a completely opposite action of those values, to the contradictions that live within us as individuals that we must move forward with each and every day. And today I want us to consider the contradiction between urgency and slowing down, urgency and intentionality. The author and scholar Bayo Okomolafe says, the times are urgent. We must slow down. Oftentimes, when we think about contradiction, we think about it as an either or type of state, where we can either be in a state of urgency or we can either be in a state of intentionality. But the beauty of holding contradiction, of practicing holding it within our bodies, is that it's not either or, it's both and. We are living in urgent times, and we must slow down. So finding yourself in your body right in this moment, noticing the position that you're in, whether you're standing, walking, sitting, laying down, if you're multitasking, or if you're simply listening. Noticing what your state of being is right now. And as you're noticing, find your breath. Begin to bring some conscious awareness to your breathing. Allowing yourself to breathe a little bit deeper, to take in a bit more oxygen. Receiving care from the earth around you, in the form of this breath right here. Now it's pretty easy to drum up a sense of urgency. Just imagine one of the thousands upon thousands of images of horror we've seen in the past almost year. That these atrocities continue daily and are expanding. The urgency is close. The urgency is ready. The urgency is there. Yes, we do have to take action right now. And noticing where this urgency lands in your body. How does it move inside of you? For me, I feel it like this frenetic ball of spiraling energy that sort of zooms around in the center of my being. And as you're maintaining awareness of that, what does it feel like? What does it look like to begin to invite a sense of slowness in, a sense of intentionality? Being in right relationship with each other, being in right relationship with the earth. This requires intentionality, and intentionality requires us to slow down. To notice where we might be reacting from a place of conditioning versus a place of conscious decision making. Both and holding this urgency, noticing the slowness. How do these two interact with each other internally? How does that shift how you show up in the world? And as the pace of our world continues to be frenetic, continues every day to oftentimes assault us with what's happening, with continued tragedy, continued horror, with continued urgency, I invite you to slow down, to notice the interplay between these two. Thank you for practicing with me today.
Melissa, thanks as always for grounding us and for joining us every week. I know a lot of our comrades appreciate it, so appreciate you. And Samara, let's bring you up. Samara, there's we've been talking a little bit about Jeremy Scahill's new news outlet, Dropsite News, and they have a lot of good coverage. There's a story, I think it was either yesterday or today, with a little bit of some reflections and insight on how the response has been to the pager attacks from Hezbollah officials. Certainly caught them off guard, so I take it caught you off guard as well. We've been going back and forth about the proximity and the reality of a ground war, a larger regional war, and today's kind of threat level is back up to sort of the top of the charts. Looking forward to hearing your assessment of that. One thing I do want to kind of just point from that article, and I'll drop it in the chat in a second, is that they interviewed a Lebanese journalist, Ali Jazini, and There was something he said which spoke to a little bit of what I was talking about in the opening, which is, he said that this is the only way to wage war for the Israelis. It's a dirty war. They're aiming to change the whole perspective of the world on how to wage war and what is legitimate or not to survive. So instead of complying with international law, they're trying to change the whole concept of international law. And that's the real danger here. And I think that resonates quite a bit in this moment and after almost 11 months coming up on 12 months of genocide that how far the goalposts have shifted. So I'll turn it over to you, but just wanted to kind of at some point hear your thoughts a little bit on that question as well about the shifting goalposts. So thanks for being with us again, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Thomas. It's great to be here. And yeah, I mean, it's hard not to see among all of the other casualties from all of this, the sort of last vestiges of any sort of like international legal system or a shared set of norms just collapsing along with it. Yeah, what a horrifying sight it's been. I think that that analysis is pretty spot on. But I do think it's also important for us to think about those things as being a manifestation of weakness, right? Like Israel, in its desperation, is doing some really wonky, really out of left field things that, and I'm sure a lot of you have been feeling a lot of despair over the last few weeks and months as things sort of grind on endlessly. But I actually think there are some important silver linings here. There's a lot to see from what's happening that should give us some cause for hope and some consideration. So hopefully that comes through amid all the devastation in the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. Um, so just getting right into it. Um, the overall death toll increase in Gaza this past week was relatively low in terms of the official numbers. It went up by about 150. We all know, and of course, we've had multiple conversations about how those official numbers are an extreme undercount, and even those Lancet numbers that people talk a lot about now are also outdated in a way that makes it really hard to capture the scale of devastation here and the loss of human life. One really strong reminder of that this past week, of course, that I'm sure a lot of people saw was the Gaza Health Ministry releasing the latest list of people's names, ages, dates of birth of among the dead. They pulled together a list of 36 or 37,000 or so names. And those are all the people that they've officially identified as being killed directly from Israeli military assault. So again, this doesn't count anybody who's died under the rubble or from communicable diseases or starvation. And it doesn't count people who were, whose bodies were unidentifiable as a result of the Israeli attacks. But even just this list, I'm sorry, yeah, the number is 34,000. Even just this list, it's just bone chilling. I'm sure folks have seen it. 169 babies, pages and pages of people where you can see here on this list on the right, the ages are all zeros, right? Pages and pages of zeros. You have to get through 100 pages of these names before you get to anybody over the age of 10. I'm sorry, 10 or up. So under the age of 10, I think is the first 100 pages. And over 200 pages to get to any adults, and I think a lot of folks understandably have spent a lot of time, really sitting with the horror of those numbers for the children in particular. But at the other end of the list is also devastating in its own way. There's a 103-year-old man on that list, somebody who was born over 20 years before the state of Israel even existed, and managed to live through all of this, only to be killed by Israeli bombs. It's a real gut punch. So I did want to spend a minute on that. There isn't much more to say about it other than the horror of it is really just a little bit brain breaking. So it's hard, I think, for all of us to sort of sit with that. And yet I feel like it is important for us to sit with that. In the context of how those things have been, how that violence is manifesting across Gaza, we can sort of take a look as we do each week, going up the strip from Rafah upward to see what fresh horrors Israel has brought us this week. In Rafah, there's a lot of interesting things that are happening here. Last week, for folks who joined the PSA, we had discussed the IDF's announcement of victory in Rafah, saying that the battalion in Rafah had been completely defeated. We talked a little bit about what that terminology means for the IDF and also why that announcement probably actually didn't mean anything at all. The idea of defeating Hamas anywhere in the Gaza Strip has completely eluded the IDF, and there was no reason to think that Rafah would be different. And sure enough, here we are 1 week after their announcement of victory in Rafah, where now I think 4 or 5 at least Israeli troops have died in Rafah just this week in fighting with militants on the ground there. So yeah, clearly this idea of the victory last week was nothing more than propaganda, as expected. And we can actually find, I think, a more realistic assessment of what's happening there from the commentary of right-wing Israelis, who obviously aren't exactly sympathetic to Palestinian lives in any meaningful way, but as has been the case, I would say, throughout Israel's history, sometimes you get a more honest reading from the further right forces within the Israeli political class, Jabotinsky being the sort of titular example of that, where like they don't really feel the need to spin it. They're happy to just say what it is because they're the racism and the desire for conquest is just on full display. So there were a series of right-wing attacks on the IDF in terms of like proving that the idea of victory in Rafah was total nonsense. And among the things that they had mentioned, I think some Likud member of the Knesset said that that announcement had no basis in reality, was the quote. And one of the things that they had talked about was, okay, according to the IDF's assessments, there are 4 battalions in Rafah. That means there are at least 8,000 fighters, plus God knows how many that are being trained and recruited, and whatever fighters have moved to the south from other areas. And if there are a minimum of 8,000 fighters in Rafah, the real number is probably upwards of 12,000. The IDF is claiming to have killed 2,000. And that includes, the IDF's numbers are anybody who they shoot in an area that they haven't designated as a safe zone is considered a terrorist, right? And so when they say 2,000 fighters have been killed, they really just mean civilians. But even if you take that number, right, you're talking about nowhere near enough to actually sizably impact the sort of capabilities of Hamas on the ground there. So just to say, all of this carnage, all of this bloodshed, all of the loss still isn't meaningfully keeping Hamas from being able to fight back in a way that leads us to where we are a year into this, and none of Israel's objectives have been met. That the fighting is ongoing. Hamas is obviously degraded in its military capabilities, but nothing near defeated. So like it's an ongoing game that seemingly has no end. And I think we can see some shift in the rhetoric there around the way the Egyptians are talking about the border. Given the fact that the Egyptian government, which we talked about a month ago, had been willing to sort of softly acknowledge the possibility of a long-term Israeli military presence at the border, is now actually saying no, they won't accept any security changes at the border, which is a sign, I think, of the Egyptians reading the dynamic changing on the ground, because there's a reason for them to have previously tried to say yes and are now saying no. Whether they actually mean no is a different story, but the fact that they feel like they can make that demand speaks to, I think, a changing power balance in Gaza, and in Rafah in particular. Moving up a bit to Khan Yunis, not a ton of new updates here other than ongoing Israeli strikes and the slow return to the city of Khan Yunis after the large-scale evacuations that happened last month. In Gaza City, there were some really wild updates this week. Another series of really horrific airstrikes, including on a bakery and a school. And I also wanted to uplift this article from 972 magazine that talks about this ongoing new plan that's openly being debated within Israeli policy circles and within the military, specifically around the idea of using northern Gaza as a zone to exercise total control over the area. And so I would definitely recommend, there's always a few articles that I tell people that I think they should read this week. This is one of those articles that I definitely think is worth a read. Um, the idea being that the entire civilian population from the north can be removed forcibly, and then whoever remains in the north would be basically considered to be a terrorist because they refuse to leave, and therefore the Israeli military is justified in using processes of, and this is the actual quote, process of starvation and extermination. It's a particularly important article, I think, because it talks about how much approval this plan has gained within Israeli circles and the limitations it still faces and why it's still possible for that not to happen. And a lot of that is external pressure and the ways in which the international community and arms embargo and the threats of an increased level of Western nations turning on Israel is the main thing that's stopping it from happening. So that continues to be a real threat on the horizon that I think we really need to take seriously, but it's not a foregone conclusion yet. And the changing dynamics I think are helping that to prevent it from being a reality. In the West Bank, I wanted to also uplift this article about another American activist who was shot. This one in early August. Just to say that the Aishanur Ezgi Agi case that we talked about last week isn't anywhere near a one-off. This is a very common phenomenon. It's just rare that it results in murder. It's usually just like maimings, but there are plenty of U.S. citizens who have been shot in the West Bank in these protests. Not that the U.S. citizen's life is any more important than the Palestinian ones who are shot constantly, but I do think it lays bare the U.S. hypocrisy that underlies a lot of its attitude towards Palestine generally. The other West Bank news that folks may have seen just in the past day was this video footage of IDF soldiers tossing bodies off of a roof in the West Bank. It's really difficult video footage to watch, and of course, now that it's gained international prominence, the Israeli government says that it's investigating it, but as we've seen from past investigations, that's not very likely to result in anything. Very tellingly, the IDF claims that they conducted a raid against a terrorist organization and had killed the head of the terrorist organization. And that's their terminology. So they don't specify what the organization is or who the person is. They just say the head of a terrorist organization, which I think makes it extremely clear that they are sort of post facto justifying the murders that their soldiers committed in the West Bank without any real, intelligence to prove why those people were of any political significance. So a lot happening in Palestine this past week, even though folks probably didn't get to pay a lot of attention to it, given the sort of way that what happened in Lebanon overshadowed everything else. Obviously, the Lebanon stuff is huge and horrifying. It's really hard to overstate, I think, what a big step this is, not only in terms of regional escalation, but also as it relates to, as Thomas was mentioning at the top, the ways in which the laws of war, to the extent that they even exist, are continuing to sort of degrade to the point of meaninglessness. This act of, there's really no other word to describe it than terrorism. The setting off of thousands of bombs in crowded civilian centers. It's hard to think of it as anything else. And I'm sure folks know that the stage one were these pagers, the thousands of pagers that went off. There's been a series of investigations already, like preliminary research into where those came from and what the story here is. What seems to be the case, although there's still a lot of questioning, happening at this stage, but what seems to be the case is that the Israelis set up a fake pager company or like an electronics communications company in Hungary that was a reseller for these Taiwanese pagers. And that company has been operating for a decade now, I think, and has many, many, many actual customers who just get regular pagers. But the whole thing was set up specifically so that those pagers could be intercepted and sent to Hezbollah, which has been trying to move away from mobile phones because they're so easily trackable by the Israelis. And so this has been like a decade-long strategy that the Israeli Mossad, the intelligence agency, along with the army, have been working together to do. And it's not just the pagers, right? We saw the day after the pagers, a series of walkie-talkies also exploded. I heard some things about other electronics like laptops and phones, but I haven't seen that confirmed anywhere. To my knowledge, it's just pagers and the walkie-talkies, which, led to a number of deaths, including a number of children, a lot of people being maimed in a way that is very attention grabbing on the international stage. Obviously, it's a novel form of warfare that people hadn't seen before. It's bone chilling in its implications about how supply chains can be intercepted in this way and the ways in which it reduces faith in sort of general technology trade as whatever it may be, for good reason. And I think we're overdue for this reckoning, but like the fact that Israel so easily violated these really basic international norms with no consequences from Western states, quite the contrary, with a series of attaboys, as if the thing that they did was in any way um, justifiable or moral or strategic, right? Like um, the impact, of course, is on Hezbollah's ability to communicate. That's taken a big hit until they figure out a new plan without these pagers. There's conceivably a sort of morale hit. I think, it's embarrassing for Hezbollah to find itself in a situation like this. But in terms of its actual impact, it's quite small, right? You're talking about a fighting force with 100,000 members, of which a few hundred were seriously injured. It's not a really meaningful degradation, but it's aimed to, as Israel's sort of, these acts of spectacular violence that it continues to commit are always sort of aimed specifically to do this thing that the United States also tries to do in its colonial projects, which is inflict so much violence that the population turns against the militant group, right? That's always the sort of the core underlying motivation here. And so the idea was this is going to cause people to lose faith in Hezbollah. What we've heard on the ground is, of course, and what always happens in situations like this is the exact opposite of that. It's a rally around the flag. So if anything, tensions are higher than they were, which is, a surprise to probably absolutely nobody. The way that Western media has been talking about this and the sort of rank racism on display online and in the mouths of our politicians and whatever around this act of terrorism that killed many children and maimed countless civilians, is really just it's a spectacle to see. It's not hard to imagine what the Western media narrative would have looked like if this had happened somewhere else. Like if, cell phones exploded in the United States or laptops had bombs in them in Israel, the, entire quote unquote Western world would be losing their minds over this act of terrorism. But because it happened to Arabs, it's somehow totally fine. This editorial cartoon that was published in the some Detroit newspaper just yesterday or this morning, I think really speaks to the level of rank racism here. Um, and the way that it's sort of like a joke, right, or a game to people where the level of suffering inflicted by this attack that accomplishes nothing is really hard to wrap your head around, I think. But the pager and walkie-talkie attack, I think, is important to consider not only in how it happened, but in why it happened now. This campaign that's been going on by the Israelis for years, right? That successfully on their end resulted in thousands of Hezbollah members having pagers. They've had them for months now, right? So the question is like why they chose this week to detonate them. And I think one possible interpretation of that is, of course, that this could be the prelude to a larger military offensive. And those of you who have been attending the PSAs know we've been talking about the possibility of a larger military offensive for a long time now. It's been months and months and months. So it's this constant game of like, will it happen? And it's hard to say. It's hard to definitively say one way or another. But I think, again, as Thomas said right at the top, it feels like it's never been closer than it is right now. And I think, it's telling that I didn't get it into the slides, but there was, I believe, a Wall Street Journal article just yesterday saying that the Pentagon's assessment is that an invasion of Lebanon is imminent. So it's very, very possible. It's very telling that those pager and walkie-talkie explosions were followed by a series of really intense aerial bombardments, the most intense in years, I think, onto Lebanon. So all of that does really sort of seem to imply that things are moving in that direction. The fact that Yoav Gallant, who has historically made very public statements about not wanting to escalate things on the Lebanese border, is now saying that Israel's focus has moved to the northern front as a new phase of the war is a troubling sign. Although the fact that Yoav Gallant specifically is saying this, I think also contains within it uh, the seeds of a different sort of perspective on this, which is that a lot of this is a sort of internal fight within the Israeli cabinet itself. One thing that's been coming out for the past week, in the days before this attack specifically, was that Netanyahu was gearing up specifically to fire Yoav Gallant. And the friction between those two leaders has always been really high. It's been clear that the United States government, for example, has been trying to boost up Gallant as an alternative to Netanyahu, and Netanyahu has been trying to get rid of him for a series of reasons. Among them, one of the ostensible reasons that was given is that Gallant doesn't want to invade Lebanon, but Netanyahu does, so he wants to replace him with a defense minister who's more hawkish. But the other big reason, and perhaps the more important reason, actually, might be that Yoav Gallant has been supportive of this new Supreme Court decision that ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel have to fight in the IDF. Like they're not immune from conscription, and that is a huge threat to Netanyahu's political coalition. So he might be replacing the defense minister with somebody who actually agrees with him that those ultra-Orthodox like ultra-Orthodox Israelis don't have to serve in the IDF because, yeah, he needs their votes. So this person that ostensibly might be replacing Yoav Gallant does fit both of those criteria, a strong hawk with no military experience and happy to continue the exemption for ultra-Orthodox military service. But whether that's the actual underlying thing that's happening here, hard to say. Those might be just two things that are happening in parallel. So it'll be curious to see how that develops. It would be wild, frankly, for the Israeli government to put somebody with basically no military experience in charge of the potentially upcoming invasion of Lebanon, but I don't know, they've done dumber things, so it's possible. On the ceasefire front, you're finally getting some acknowledgement within the Biden administration for what we've been saying on the PSAs for months now, which is that the ceasefire isn't happening. It's certainly not happening under Biden's term. And I think not only are you getting a bunch of leaks saying that, Blinken isn't capable of getting this over the finish line, you even see in the articles that still maintain some semblance of hope that a ceasefire is coming. Those articles, I think, for me at least, make an even clearer case that it's not happening. So even just as an example, that the top of this political article about, what is being considered to break the ceasefire impasse, you can see the second paragraph here says Ideas have ranged from allowing Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar safe passage out of Gaza to giving human rights organizations access to Israel's prisoners to reducing the number of Israeli troops along the Egyptian border, according to officials familiar with the planning. It shouldn't take a lot, and for anyone who's been attending these PSAs to know, like none of those are going to get this over the line. There's literally no way that that's going to be the thing that fixes it. So the fact that they're not willing to push to the point where, for example, the number of Israeli troops along the Egyptian border is zero, which was the agreed upon position several months ago, means that it's just not going to get there. I'd be very shocked if we were to see a ceasefire before the changing of the administration, although maybe after the election, the calculus might be a little bit different. Where things are actually moving a little bit more is on the arms embargo side, which I think is very telling given, how arms embargo has become the sort of foundational piece of if you want to talk about a ceasefire, the only way to get there is through the arms embargo. And we are seeing, evidence of that very clearly. Here in the US, two big things that are happening this week. One, Bernie Sanders is putting out a Senate resolution to block all arms sales to Israel. It won't pass, right? There's no way all of the Republicans will vote against it, as will a bunch of the Zionist Democrats, but it will be really interesting to see who votes for it and who votes against it. And that should be a way to sort of think through some electoral strategies going forward. Outside of the legislative side, the arms transfers to Israel are currently being investigated by the inspectors general of various departments. So the State Department, the Defense Department, and the Justice Department, I think, are all putting out reports sometime very soon about the legality of these U.S. weapons transfers, given that they're objectively giving weapons to another country that is violating international human rights. There isn't really any question about that. Even the Biden administration sort of tacitly admits that at this point. So it'll be really interesting to see what those investigations say and what impact they might end up having. It's hard to know what they'll say and how good they'll be. Even these inspector general offices are often pretty captured, right, by the political class. But it is worth noting that, like, for example, USAID's Inspector General put out a report on that Gaza pier that was actually pretty good. It really demonstrated that, like, the whole thing was a PR stunt. Um, and we are in a moment now where every single other major country has at least restricted weapon sales to Israel, including the UK, Canada, Japan, the Netherlands, Spain, and Belgium, which, is everybody except the US and Germany at this point. And now it seems that Germany also has more or less stopped weapons transfers to Israel, which is a huge development. And it's funny because this isn't actually new news. It's just a thing that's been revealed recently, but apparently no offensive weapons exports have been approved since March, which is a huge drop given that, as you can see in this little pie chart here, that Germany has historically provided a third of all arms transfers to Israel, way behind the United States, obviously, but the second largest provider by far. And it's worth noting a few things here. One is that since March part of that sentence, which, March is exactly when Nicaragua took Germany to the ICJ to prosecute them for enabling genocide by giving weapons to Israel. So, like, again, just goes to show that some of the sort of ICJ stuff has an impact, even though it doesn't feel like it in the moment. The other part is the no offensive weapons piece, right? So Germany does distinguish between defensive weapons that it gives to Israel and offensive weapons that it gives to Israel. And it's worth noting that both of those are significantly down. I think defensive weaponry licenses have reduced by like a factor of 10 or something. But offensive weapon licenses have gone down to zero. And that's a huge, huge development, and one hopefully that can be built on to also bring that some of that pressure here to the U.S. and maybe those inspector general reports will be part of that. So I think that will be an important advocacy opportunity when those are out. Speaking of the ICJ and the impact that it has, this report from the UN Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights that Thomas also mentioned at the top, put out this really important report about the importance for every country to comply with the ICJ's opinion on the illegality of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. I put all of the recommendations on a slide here because I think they're valuable, but I would recommend that folks go read that report. It's quite strong. And I did want to highlight just a couple of things from that list of recommendations, in addition to the sort of general, take steps to like reverse the recognition of Israel's control over occupied Palestinian lands. Um, on this list, it specifically says number 4 is impose a full arms embargo on Israel, halting all arms agreements. Number 5 is like ban goods that are made in occupied territories. 6, cancel and suspend economic relationships, trade agreements, and academic relations with Israel. So that's like full call for BDS coming from the UN Office of Human Rights, which wild. And then a series of other really fascinating things. Among them, the only other one that I wanted to note here is ensure the full protection of Palestinians. Wait, no, sorry, not that one, although that one is also important. But number 10, rescind legislation and policies that criminalize and penalize advocacy in support of Palestinian rights to self-determination and opposition to Israel's occupation and apartheid. So the idea that, like, as we're seeing here, right, the criminalization of those of us trying to advocate for Palestinian freedom is an explicit recommendation from the UN at this point. Meanwhile, on the ICC side, a fascinating thing happened this week where the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs put out a statement denouncing the arrest warrants that were issued for Netanyahu and Gallant. The funny thing here being that the arrest warrants have not, of course, been issued. And we don't really know when they will be issued. So it's unclear what is happening here. It's got to be, I think, one of two things. Either the foreign ministry is has gotten knowledge that those arrest warrants are coming and prepared a press release for when they drop and then accidentally released it. They did delete all of this off of all their social media, by the way, so you can't find it anymore. So that does lead me to think that that was the thing. The other possibility is that they knew it was coming and they did this to sort of like pressure it into not happening. So it like wasn't by accident. It was some sort of strategic move, but doesn't seem like it. This looks like an egg on your face sort of moment where they accidentally released something they weren't supposed to release yet. It's weird because this was 5 days ago and there are still no arrest warrants. So it's not super clear what's happening here, but I guess we'll find out soon. And then the other big news this week is just the UN General Assembly vote, the first in decades that took a tone like this. 124 countries voting in favor and only 14 countries voting against. That's 90 to 1, 90 to 10. Basically supporting the ICJ position and calling for countries to sanction Israel until it ends its illegal occupation of Palestine. The two things that I think are worth noting here, just quickly, that the 14 countries that voted against it are the typical ones. It's, the United States, Israel, Argentina, Czechia, I think, are like the 4 biggest countries on that list, Hungary, and then a couple of others, Paraguay and Malawi. And I think that's it. The rest of them are just like the Pacific Islander countries that are more or less forced to vote whichever way the United States tells them to because they're entirely dependent on the United States. And that's it. Like the fact that all the other Western countries, the UK, all the European countries, Canada, Australia, all abstained is very telling, I think, about a shifting political dynamic in terms of, this is a very strong resolution, again, calling for basically a global condemnation of Israel for its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So yeah, it's hard to overstate what a big deal that is. Meanwhile, inside Israel itself, things economically are looking pretty bad. I think some folks maybe have seen there's a few social media things going around about Israel's impending economic collapse. I think those are a little overstated, to be frank. I think the situation economically for Israel is unquestionably very bad, but it's not yet catastrophic. The GDP in Israel is still actually going up, not down. Although some giant chunk of that is that their defense industry is sort of buoying the collapse of the tourism and tech industries. It does seem like both of those are really facing a very difficult economic moment. And to the extent that this war continues, the impact on Israel, and particularly from like BDS pressures and things around that, are likely only going to increase. So it is possible that it is in a spiral that it will never be able to reemerge from, but I don't think that's a guarantee in this moment just yet. Wanted to touch for just a second on campus protests, where I think the UC system is very telling. You can see two UCLA things on this slide for those of you that are watching. On the left is a request for new equipment from the University of California Office for the President, including a request from UCLA to buy like gas launchers, pepper spray, munitions, and drones, and a series of other offensive weaponry. So the UCLA is using taxpayer money to buy weaponry to attack anti-genocide protesters on its campus that are calling for divestment. A really horrifying development that I think is somewhat counterbalanced by the fact that the UCLA student government put out a resolution also just this past week, rescinding and undoing the encampment bans that the UC administration imposed, basically saying that the University of California wants to ban encampments, but they're critical for free speech and for people who are fighting against like apartheid and genocide. So no, actually, encampments are fine on our campus, which is pretty dope. You should give that a read. It's a good statement. And some updates on BDS2, where there's some really strong actions against Boeing, and the successful termination of the first ever American-Israeli weapons manufacturer partnership at a university at MIT. So some really big wins on the BDS front this week, as has been the case almost every week that we've been talking recently. So that's been good to see. I did want to note the uncommitted movements statement that came out this week. I'm sure folks saw it, basically saying that they couldn't endorse Kamala Harris, given that she failed to meet even their most basic requests. The statement also notes that Trump poses a greater danger to Palestinians than a Harris campaign, and encouraged people not to vote third parties. So it's a funny sort of like almost endorsing Harris, but not explicitly saying you're endorsing Harris. It's an odd statement, I think, in a lot of ways that speaks to the difficulty of the messaging in this moment, and the fact that all of those things, I think, are true, that Trump would be more dangerous, very likely, and Kamala Harris has totally failed to do even the smallest meaningful material gesture in direction of a ceasefire. There's this interview that I linked to here, where Eugene Daniels asks Kamala Harris to kind of elaborate on her position on arms transfers to Israel. And she talks for 3 minutes without saying a single thing. It's infuriating to watch. And I recommend that you do it so you can be infuriated like me. So in sum, the pacification strategy that Israel is employing in Gaza just straight up isn't working, right? There isn't a single area of Gaza that the IDF actually meaningfully controls, but how long that holding pattern can hold is hard to say. The invasion of Lebanon is looking more likely than ever, but hard to know whether it will actually happen or not. Right now, my money is on it happening, but I think it really could go either way. There's a lot of pressure going in both directions right now. International pressure on Israel is really meaningfully working, even though it feels very slow, although the US hasn't really budged nearly as much as basically everywhere else on Earth, which means that we all have our work cut out for us. And that economic pressure inside Israel is also building, but has not yet reached a sort of catastrophic phase. And Kamala Harris, in these last 2 months of the campaign, is really trying to get away with saying nothing. And I think it's incumbent on us to force her to say something. Some quick upcoming events. I just want to note that Arab Cultural and Community Center is doing meet and greets with the mayor. So if folks want to meet Aaron Peskin this Saturday, I think that would be great. I'm hoping to be there tomorrow, actually. So maybe I'll see you there. Some really great fundraisers and actions. Asada is doing a action on the anniversary of the Bhopal disaster. There are a series of benefit concerts and events, including AROC's Gaza fundraiser in October, but those are a little ways out, so we don't have to talk about them yet. If you want to know more about them, go to the calendar. And if you want to be informed on our text blast system, just text PSA to 833-633-0604 and follow the PAL Media Tracker for insights on the stories that inform this analysis. Thank you all so much.
Sammer, thanks. Before you go, I just wanted to note, you mentioned that story, the Pentagon report, right? That there's some indication that the Pentagon believes that this ground invasion is likely or imminent. Um, I didn't have enough time to do this, but alongside Matt Miller and all of the other administration spokespeople is Sabrina Singh, who is the Pentagon spokesperson, who yesterday actually said that the Pentagon believes that the war is contained in Gaza itself. Random side note, I just found out that Sabrina Singh is married to Mike Smith, the political director for Nancy Pelosi. Who at various times has called for some sort of cessation on arms transfer. So I wonder what those conversations are in that household about
Huh.
going back and forth behind the scenes. But there is a question in the chat that I thought might be something we can get to, as we're closing out from Christina Sheriff, and it says, I believe that halting some of the weapons from UK included only sales directly to Israel, but not weapons onto the international market where Israel can purchase anyway. Is that the case with Germany as well?
I think that's right. I think that's spot on. So most countries, the US and Germany included, do uh, the weapons are private, right? The weapons transfers are happening from private companies directly to Israel, but they have to be approved by the government. So you need an arms license transfer agreement. And what Germany has done is basically suspended those transfer agreements, which means that they can sell them. They cannot sell the weapons to the government of Israel. But yeah, there's a huge secondary market for a lot of this stuff. So a lot of things will probably end up there, but it does make the logistics, the purchasing orders, these are things that are done years in advance, right? These are very large, logistically complex purchasing operations. So it's a meaningful impact. I don't think it means that Israel will be starved for weaponry, but the fact that Israel is sort of spooling up its own domestic weapons manufacturing capabilities, I think is a sign that they also acknowledge that the age of getting cheap weapons from its Western allies is rapidly coming to an end. And I do think that that's probably the case. Interestingly, also, the other thing that happened this week that I didn't touch on is that Israel is caught on the other side of that, which is it has been caught sending weapons to Russia, right, to get around Western sanctions. So weapons that the U.S. is selling to Israel, Israel is reselling to Russia. So yeah, that like just to say, it's a little bit like putting water in a swimming pool. Everything sort of gets everywhere, but um, yeah, I think it matters, and there will be ways to circumvent it. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, worth us maybe trying to map that out in future, just in terms of the secondary markets and what the ramifications are. But I really appreciate your analysis here. One thing I just want to share with everyone else before, for those who stuck around, we are now on Spotify. We decided to at least make it available for recording for those that only want or can listen to the audio. So follow us on Spotify. I will drop a link in the chat now, so you can do that and rate us if you want to. That would be great. And we will be back again this coming week. So thanks everyone for joining us, and as always, share these out with your friends and comrades, and we'll stick around if there are any